In this lesson, we're going to look at some of the more uncomfortable topics raised by World War II, namely total war, what that really means for the people involved, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and some really uncomfortable gray areas between good and bad. The main question that I'm going to pose to you in this lesson is, how can you tell which side is justified in its actions in a war? Are there good guys and bad guys? And if so, by what criteria can you tell them apart? It is really tempting to make World War II into a story of good versus evil. There was a very clear side that started the war and that perpetrated a genocide. Clearly, the Nazis were not in the right. However, the temptation to label history in terms of good and bad Several related questions that you can think about as we go include, who can legitimately be killed during a war? Are the people in a state responsible for the actions of the people who lead the state? What are war crimes? What should be off limits during war? Does the way people kill others in war make a difference in evaluating the morality of that action? Does physical distance from a military target change the morality of killing in wartime? And if taxpayers fund the army, are taxpayers then responsible for what the army does? It can be really tempting to make World War II into a story of good guys versus bad guys, and it is really, really, really important not to do that for several reasons. First, the Holocaust was clearly so horrific that it's really easy to fall into the trap of making this complex history a morality story of good versus evil. And that is dangerous because it limits your ability to understand the war fully, and it limits your ability to critically evaluate the side that you've decided is the good one. Labeling one side evil implies that the other side is good, and it's easy from then to make the logical fallacy that the good side must do good things, and therefore everything the good side did is acceptable because it was fighting something that was completely evil. It is really important when we're thinking about history to hold all sides to a moral standard that is consistent and to speak clearly when they fail to meet them, even if they were failing to meet moral standards in pursuit of a goal that we agree with. Deciding that one side is good, for example, can keep us from learning some really important lessons from history. For example, the United States in World War II was fighting the Nazis, whose ideology was destructive and who perpetrated the Holocaust. Clearly, that was a noble fight. We can be horrified by the Holocaust, and at the same time, we can critically look at the decision of the Allies to firebomb civilian targets, or the United States' decision to drop 2 weapons of mass destruction, atomic weapons, on civilian targets, the only time that's ever happened in war. Or after the war, we can think pretty critically about the decision of several Western states, including the United States, to resettle Nazi scientists in the United States to work on our space program. Both of those things can be true at the same time. We can condemn the actions of the Nazis and look critically at the actions of the Allied government as well, and hopefully learn all of the lessons from this horrible war. Next, it's dangerous to make heroes and villains in history because it makes the bad side out to seem like it was obviously evil, like Hitler must have been a recognizable monster from the very beginning, which then blinds us to the scarier fact that societies can normalize some pretty appalling behavior en masse and do terrible things to other people while believing themselves to be right, and that this can happen everywhere. In other words, if we expect to see a monster if we're looking out for the next Hitler, we're going to miss the more banal sort of evil, the more everyday sort of destructive demagogic leaguer that could lead society down a similar path. Next, That banality of evil idea, that's a phrase from Hannah Arendt, the scholar of totalitarianism. That is something that we need to reckon with as well, because it's not just the Nazi leadership that committed the crimes that resulted in the Holocaust. And it wasn't just people in the SS. It was everybody contributing in different ways to dehumanizing different populations to the point where society would allow that to happen. And it was people in like regular, everyday, kind of boring bureaucratic jobs that worked to that conclusion without necessarily thinking that they were doing something terrible. The bigger point is that there really are no good guys and bad guys in history. History is made by people, and people are flawed. It is good for some people and bad for others, and the way that we tell and investigate those stories will either let us learn the real lessons that we need to learn from the past, or blind us to them. Pointing out areas where non-Nazis failed to live up to their own standards, for what it's worth, in no way excuses or diminishes the crimes of the Nazis. We can have complex thoughts, right? We can say, like, it was right to fight these people. They were doing horrible things. And we need to learn from all of the horrors that happened during this war. Looking for good and evil also makes you make assumptions about history and clean it up, when in fact it's really messy. For example, if you think of World War II as a story about good guys and bad guys, you'd expect there to be justice at the end, right? But actually, things were pretty terrible after the war too. There were war trials for some of the war criminals from the Nazi leadership, but others remained in power. Some of them, like I mentioned before, were imported to the United States. And if you expected Europeans to be friendly to the people who were released for concentration camps, you're in for a pretty depressing surprise. Reality is messy. So you should expect limited justice after the war and like icky moral compromise, and that's just kind of part of it. And finally, like the biggest thing, making good guys and bad guys out of history is propaganda. It is not historical analysis. So if you look for history only to tell you about what you've done well as a country, you're not actually looking for history at all. That is propaganda. And that is exactly the kind of thing that good historical thinking should be combating, because the past is messy and complicated. So with that disclaimer, let's look at this whole messy business, starting with how the war ended and where that sets us up. The Allies were able to win World War II after the United States entered the war in 1941 and the Soviet Union entered the war in 1942 on the Ally side. Those two new alliances brought with them a huge advantage in terms of resources and manpower and a whole extra front that Germany would have to fight that then proved to be insurmountable. Specifically, over here on the map, keep your eyes on the map. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in this direction, he failed, and he provoked this giant state with a newly industrialized, pretty patriotic army into the conflict against him. The Soviet Union had masses and masses and masses of soldiers, and it threw them at the German line. So for the next 3 years, you'd have the Soviet army progressively marching towards the west to squeeze the Nazis back into Germany and eventually all the way to the capital in Berlin. Soviet manpower was critical to winning this war, because as you'll see in the next slide, Soviet casualties in the pursuit of this goal to squeeze the Nazis back west were just astronomical. When the United States entered the war, they brought with them resources and industry that are crucial to winning total wars. So weapons, technology, money, and also troops. This gave the Allies the material capacity necessary to overwhelm the Axis forces, while the Soviet soldiers were wearing down the German army in the east. In Europe, the war ended when American and British forces landed over here on Normandy Beach and began to squeeze the Nazi army towards the east from the west, back into its little state lines over here in Berlin, reclaiming territory as they went. The Soviets did the same thing from the east, And eventually, they made it to Berlin. Hitler kills himself. The war's over in Europe. As the Soviets were making their way this way, the horrors of the Holocaust began to come to light because a lot of the death camps were in this zone right here. So after the war, the Nuremberg trials were set up. Fantastic archive of primary source resources about the whole war, by the way, online for free, if you look up the Nuremberg trials and their evidence. But it was a series of trials held by an international court to bring Nazi war criminals to justice for committing crimes against humanity and war crimes. And it was the very first, actually, prosecution of crimes against humanity, setting a pretty important precedent. Also, what happened, though, as a result of retaking Europe in this manner, you get tension between the Soviet Union and the United States that is going to spill over and then become the next global conflict, the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were able to work together effectively to defeat the Axis powers. But it was still an alliance of a communist state and a very capitalist state. And so, like, those two states didn't ever really trust each other completely. Next, because of the way they defeated the Axis powers, the stage was set for major tension after the war, because both the Soviet Union and the United States believed that their sacrifices and contributions had earned them the right to establish the terms of the post-war world, aligned to their own strategic interests. And of course, the interests of the United States and the Soviet Union were basically opposite. The United States wanted to rebuild Eastern Europe, tell me if you've heard this one before, through self-determination over here. So create a whole bunch of new states that can choose their own government, ideally democratic ones, so that they can become trading partners with the US and so that they don't become communist. The Soviet Union had spent 3 years and a lot of blood invading this whole land, and they stayed. They didn't leave after they'd liberated Germany. And they wanted to create a Soviet sphere of influence here and a big buffer zone between Germany and itself because, again, they had just been invaded. And while they're at it, to impose communist governments along this zone so they're not the only communist state in the whole wide world. So that was the story in Europe. For the Pacific, the war against Japan, Japan being part of the Axis powers, was won after the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima over here and Nagasaki over here, 2 civilian cities in Japan. Just to touch on this point really briefly, on this slide you'll see a pie chart of World War II deaths divided by which country suffered them. And look at the Soviet Union here. It lost over 25 million people in World War II. So you can understand how the Soviet Union might think that in losing that many people by pushing the Nazis back through the occupied territory into Germany and capturing Berlin, that they should probably have a big say in how the end of war treaty goes. After all, they recaptured and liberated a whole half of Europe. From the Soviet perspective over here, the American sacrifice is minimal, so minimal that I can't even actually find it on the pie chart. We can look over here. In the United States, World War II was experienced in terms of death as well. I certainly have relatives who died in that war, but the numbers are just so different. 400,000 Americans died in World War II. Those are 400 lives that were absolutely important. From the American perspective, it was the second most deadly war we had ever fought. So from the American perspective, that entitled the United States to a seat at the table in terms of deciding how the peace would go. But 405,000 looks really different when you're staring at a loss of 25 million. So already we can kind of see how different perspectives are going to get the world in trouble for the post-war world. The next piece of the puzzle has to do, again, with that old story of what you say you're fighting for and how achievable it is after a really awful, complex war. At the end of the war, the Allied nations came to understand the conflict to have been not just about stopping German and Japanese aggression, but also about like being a just moral fight to keep the world safe from the dangerous ideology that underpinned that German and Japanese aggression. That's totalitarian fascism, especially after the details of the Holocaust came to light. The war came to represent, to the minds of a lot of people, and certainly the statesmen who were making the peace treaties in the aftermath, a battle for the principle of universal human rights. The Allies, for their part, these guys, it's Winston Churchill from Britain over here, FDR from the United States over here, and Joseph Stalin over here from the Soviet Union. They had adopted what they called the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want, as their basic war aims. Note how vague and idealistic those war aims are. They're not specific attainable goals like we are going to capture X amount of land. They are ideals. And again, that is going to get the world in some trouble. Particularly because the conduct and nature of the Allies during war made their victory far from being a straightforward moral will. In other words, they didn't always behave like the good guys. The Allies, for example, included a totalitarian dictatorship in the Soviet Union. And so it's kind of hard to say you're fighting totalitarianism if you're working with a totalitarian. It also included nations with imperial holdings, with big empires, so nations that claimed other parts of the world as their own against the will of people in those other parts of the world. Those were Britain and France. And the Allies had targeted civilian populations in bombings, like Dresden, like Hiroshima, Tokyo, Berlin, etc., etc. These tensions between the Allies' professed aims, the things that they said they wanted, and their strategic post-war interests, that's going to lay the groundwork for the next set of conflicts the world has to deal with, namely in decolonization, which is the process of gaining independence in the colonies of these European allied powers, and the Cold War, the conflict between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union that would dominate the rest of the 20th century. One nice thing that came out of this war, in addition to clear guidelines on what is and what is not a war crime, was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which arose directly from the war experience and represented the first global expression of rights to which all human beings were inherently entitled. So please pause the slide here, take notes, and then press play again. One of the crucial facts about World War II is that it was incredibly destructive, not just for people who were engaged in fighting the war, but also for civilians, as this graph will show you. During World War II, new technologies like air raids and bombings expanded the definition of total war to include civilian targets. With the invention of the bomber airplane, World War II took the idea of total war to a whole new level by targeting enemy cities and factories where civilians worked to support the war effort. In other words, targeting civilians became a common part of war strategy for both the Axis and the Allied powers. If you look at this graph, in lilac you'll see the citizens who became casualties of the war, and in purple or magenta you'll see soldiers. A couple of things here stand out kind of immediately. First, if you look at Poland and China, the sheer scale of citizen deaths speak to the brutality of the invasions of both places. And in Poland and Eastern Europe, it also speaks to the magnitude of the Holocaust. Similarly, if you look over here at the USSR, the Soviet Union, Soviet losses completely dwarfed every other ally in soldiers, but also their civilian casualties are incredibly high from the attempted invasion, especially after 1942. It's tricky to put numbers into context when we're talking about death and comparing them across state lines. So here are a couple of other ways to get your heads around just the scale of destruction. On the top left, you'll see the fraction of different countries' populations that died in World War II, with Poland really, really, really high up there, over 15%. Belarus is also a state in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, and the rest of the Soviet Union. So you'll see that Eastern Europe took a tremendous hit generally. And then here on the right in a map, you can see civilian versus military deaths for each place. And you'll notice that in Eastern Europe, civilian deaths take up a huge percentage of the casualties. So let's look at why. First, we'll look at the most clear-cut example of moral wrong that occurred during the war, crimes against humanity, namely the Holocaust. The thing about the Holocaust is that we know how it ended. We know the whole story, and so we know exactly how destructive and damaging it was. But at the time, as it unfolded, it's really important to know that it didn't begin with the death camps at Auschwitz. The Holocaust unfolded as a slow progression of increasing discrimination against specific groups that resulted in their dehumanization in the eyes of society at large. Dehumanization means when you stop seeing a group of people as human beings that you can empathize with and begin to see them as more like animals or vermin or rodents. And when you see dehumanization in progress, you'll hear people spoken about on these terms as like pests that must be gotten rid of. It's important to know that this is a process because genocide is tragically not unique to this history. It can happen again. And one of the moral imperatives of learning history is to make sure that we do better than people did in the past and to make sure that we recognize the signs that this is going to perhaps reoccur so that we can stop it before it happens. To that end, we're going to look at what Timothy Snyder, a historian of the Holocaust, who wrote a wonderful book called Black Earth about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. We're going to see what he has to say about fascism and how it uses this concept of an enemy within to increase its power and to tragic effects for the groups identified as the enemy. Snyder writes in this interview that took place in 2017, so a year into the Trump administration. He says, with the Trump administration's Muslim ban, the resemblance to anti-Semitic policy in Germany in 1933, after Hitler took power, is that if you can pick some group and make them stand in for some international threat, then you can change domestic politics, because domestic politics is no longer then about compromises and competing interests. Domestic politics becomes about who inside the society should actually be seen as being outside society. Once you get the wedge in with the first group, then you essentially win. With the Trump administration's treatment of undocumented immigrants, I think the logic might be a little bit different. I think the goal might be to get us used to seeing a certain kind of police power and getting us used to seeing things happening to people in public. And then if we get used to that, then we might be more willing to turn the dial a little bit further. The crucial thing is to get some kind of a political opening, where people go along with or accept stigmatization. And the logic is there's always some kind of threat that comes from beyond the country, and that we can fix that threat on a group of people inside the country. And if you go along with this, what else are you agreeing to go along with? This is an important comparison because Nazi ideology basically followed this same progression. Fascist ideologies still follow the same progression. You pick a group that you label an enemy, you target society's attention at them, and then you slowly get society used to treating that group increasingly less humanely. And again, it's critical to understand that you don't just start by killing people. You get pushed to that point slowly over time as a society until a tragic end. In the case of Nazi Germany, Nazi ideology held wrongly that there were inferior races, Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, so people from Eastern Europe, the Jewish people, scapegoated for national problems. Nazis kind of claimed two things at once. They claimed that these groups made Germany weak, but also that they were strong enough to be a threat, an existential threat to Nazi Germany that justified dramatic measures to get rid of them. The path to genocide here was a long process that began with normalizing dehumanization, normalizing discrimination. So like society gets used to talking about this group of people in a way that would have been taboo before. And then society gets used to casual acts of violence. And then legal distinctions between groups. And then police violence against that group. And finally, removal from common society because they are so-called different. And then, once you see them as completely non-human or different or threatening, then the step to murder, killing them, becomes much easier. In Germany, this played out according to that pattern. If you look at the slide on the top left, you'll see materials for school children that began just casually introducing this idea that there are groups that we can discriminate against because they're bad. The first is a book that includes horrible stereotypes about the Jewish people. And over here in the middle, you'll see a math problem about calculating exactly how much of a drain on the state the disabled are. Horrible. So you start to get that kind of bias and discrimination. Then you'd get casual acts of violence against Jewish shops, paired with laws that defined the Jewish people out of citizenship and then began excluding them from different parts of society. So they couldn't be journalists, they couldn't work as doctors or dentists, they couldn't work in the universities anymore, they couldn't be parts of the armed forces. And then from there, you get to the final terrible step of removing them to concentration camps and finally death camps. The result was a crime against humanity. I'll go through the key points with you, but first, just as a recommendation, the best book that I have ever read that came from somebody who survived Auschwitz is a book called Survival in Auschwitz by a man named Primo Levi, and I really highly recommend it to anybody who wants to get a really clear view of exactly what took place in these camps. So, notes. The Holocaust refers to the mass murder of millions of people by the Nazis during World War II, often with specific reference to the Nazis' Jewish victims. The systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. Nazi ideology held that inferior races like Jews, Slavs, people from Eastern Europe, so like Polish people and Russians, and Gypsies should be scapegoated for national problems. Nazis believed that the Aryan race was racially superior and inferior, alien, foreign threats to the racial community must be eliminated. Nazi authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority. That's in air quotes because there's no such thing. This is not real science. These other groups that were targeted included the Roma, or Europe's Gypsies, the disabled, some Slavic people, Poles, Russians, and others. And other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, including communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. The genocide the Nazis intended to carry out was called the final solution. That's what they called it. Super importantly is this idea of the Holocaust as a process. It was a process that evolved and gradually got worse over time because society was able to normalize each step on the path to the final solution. So first, dehumanizing language was more frequently employed. and then discrimination became encouraged and socially acceptable. Then violence against targeted groups became socially acceptable. Then laws changed to officially discriminate against those groups. Next, groups were removed from society to ghettos, then from ghettos to concentration camps, and then in some cases to death camps or execution in the gas chambers. I've included a definition of concentration camp here because while the strongest association we might have to concentration camps is with Nazi Germany, they are not unique to Nazi Germany, so it's important to know what they are so that you can recognize them when you see them. A concentration camp is a place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, are deliberately imprisoned without any sort of rights to trial or representation in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities, sometimes forced to provide labor, sometimes to await mass execution, but not always. So pause here, take notes, and then press play again. One question to leave you with on this thought about crimes against humanity is how far down the chain of command would you hold people accountable for the Holocaust? Just the Nazi leadership? Soldiers following orders? That was the defense that a lot of them used after the war. It didn't work, but this idea that I was just following orders, it's not my fault. Would you hold accountable people who scheduled the trains that took the victims to the camps? People who promoted the racist conspiracy theories that made this all seem normal and right? People who engaged in acts of casual discrimination or who allowed dehumanizing language to become normal? Where do you draw the line? It's not so easy as it turns out. Now let's look at another reason for those civilian death tolls to have been quite so high. And that reason just involves bombing cities as a war strategy. Cities, of course, are places where lots of civilians live. So when we talk about bombing cities as a war strategy, I urge you to think specifically, as specifically as you can, about how to tell the good guy from the bad guy in cases like these. When we learned about World War I, we saw the beginnings of this idea of total war that blurred the boundary between civilian life and military personnel as the nation's entire population got wrapped up in the war effort. World War II brought this to its logical conclusion by adopting a strategy on both the Allied and the Axis side of making cities and civilians legitimate military targets, so bombing cities. On the slide, for example, you can see the results of the Blitz, which describes when Nazis changed strategies to bomb British cities after it became clear that they weren't going to be able to destroy the Royal Air Force. The Bombs Site Project is actually this fascinating website that tracks each bomb that was dropped on London between October 7th, 1940 and June 6th, 1941. And every red dot on these maps represents the dropping of a bomb. And this is just like a little snipped version of a much larger map with many, many, many more bombs. The destruction that this caused was tremendous. And when you have events like this, it's never just about the destruction of the individual bomb. It's about the psychological effect that having a city bombed out would have on that civilian population. The idea being, you can destroy a lot of stuff, maybe you can destroy some factories, but ideally you can break the spirit of the people you're bombing and kind of ruin their ability to continue to wage war that way. The part of this that becomes morally kind of icky is that the Allies did this too, on a pretty wide scale. Dresden is a fantastic example. Dresden's the city in Germany. It's this beautiful medieval city before. And towards the end of the war, British and American bombers attempted to do the same to Germany as Hitler did with the Blitz, to break the German ability to continue to wage this war by completely destroying the city. Let's look closer at this case in Dresden through the eyes of Kurt Vonnegut in his work Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut, of course, is an amazing American author who happened to be a prisoner of war in Germany, in Dresden, when Dresden was bombed. And he wrote about it in his book Slaughterhouse-Five, which I recommend highly. Vonnegut wrote, "On about February 14th, the Americans came over, followed by the RAF, the Royal Air Force. Their combined labors killed 250,000 people in 24 hours and destroyed all of Dresden, possibly the world's most beautiful city, but not me. After that, we were put to work carrying corpses from air raid shelters, women, children, old men, dead from concussion, fire, or suffocation. That the bombing of Dresden was a great tragedy, none can deny. That it was really a military necessity, few, after reading this book, will believe. It was one of those terrible things that sometimes happens in wartime, brought about by an unfortunate combination of circumstances. Those who approved it were neither wicked nor cruel, though it may well be that they were too remote from the harsh realities of war to understand fully the appalling destructive power of air bombardment in the spring 1945. The advocates of nuclear disarmament seemed to believe that, if they could achieve their aim, war would become tolerable and decent. They would do well to read this book and ponder the fate of Dresden, where 135,000 people died as the result of an air attack with conventional weapons. On the night of March 9, 1945, an air attack on Tokyo by American heavy bombers, using incendiary and high explosive bombs, caused the death of 83,793 people. The atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed 71,379 people. So it goes. Vonnegut describes the human toll of firebombing. He saw it firsthand, and I will let his words speak to what this kind of thing actually involves for human beings on the ground. Vonnegut writes, "Every day we walked into the city and dug into basements and shelters to get the corpses out as a sanitary measure. When we went into them, a typical shelter, an ordinary basement usually, looked like a streetcar full of people who'd simultaneously had heart failure. Just people sitting there in their chairs, all dead. A firestorm is an amazing thing. It doesn't occur in nature. It's fed by the tornadoes that occur in the midst of it, and there isn't a damn thing to breathe. We brought the dead out. They were loaded on wagons and taken to parks, large open areas in the city, which weren't filled with rubble. The Germans got funeral pyres going, burning the bodies to keep them from stinking and from spreading disease. 130,000 corpses were hidden underground. It was a terribly elaborate Easter egg hunt. We went to work through cordons of German soldiers. Civilians didn't get to see what we were up to. After a few days, the city began to smell, and a new technique was invented. Necessity is the mother of invention. We would bust into the shelter, gather up valuables from people's laps without attempting identification, and turn the valuables over to the guards. Then the soldiers would come in with a flamethrower and stand in the door and cremate the people inside, get the gold and jewelry out, and then burn everybody inside." Dresden wasn't the only occasion in which Allied troops bombed cities. Of course, Berlin was bombed to prepare for the invasion of troops. We can distinguish this maybe in that there was a very clear military objective to take the capital of Nazi Germany. Hitler was in it at the time. From other instances of bombing, like what happened with Tokyo. The Allies firebombed Tokyo, also late in the war, in 1945. And this was actually the deadliest bombing raid in human history. As many as 100,000 Japanese people were killed, and another 1 million were injured, most of them civilians, when more than 300 American B-29 bombers dropped 1,500 tons of firebombs on the Japanese capital that night. The inferno the bombs created reduced the area to ash. Millions of people were homeless. The human toll that night exceeded that of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which would come later that year, where the initial blasts killed about 70,000 people and 46,000 people respectively. So here we have a couple of issues. We have this like dropping bombs on cities as a war strategy, sometimes to terrorize a population, sometimes to prepare for an invasion. How do you decide which of those acts is right and justified in the context of a war? This is a question that I don't plan on answering for you, but it's a tricky one, and simple morality stories about good guys and bad guys in war ignore this whole issue. There's also the question of distance, right? If American troops had marched into Dresden or marched into Tokyo and shot all of the civilians that ended up dead because of the firebombing, that would be a very clear-cut case of a war crime. But because these were weapons that were dropped from an airplane at a distance, somehow we distinguish between those two acts. So think about that. Think about what you think of the ethics of using different weapons are. And while you're thinking, pause the slide here to take notes, then press play again. One last issue we need to confront in the legacy of World War II that calls into question the narrative of World War II as a good moral war fought by good moral sides against total evil is the question of using weapons of mass destruction on civilian targets. So not just bombs, but atomic bombs. At the end of World War II, to end the war in the Pacific, the United States used two brand new weapons on civilian targets in order to end the war, but also in order to demonstrate the destructive capacity that these weapons had. The United States wanted to flatten an entire city with an atomic bomb, and Hiroshima was the right size. There were other potential targets on the initial list of choices, including a remote military installation, but the committee decided that those options wouldn't show the world the power of the new bomb. They wanted people to understand that this is something different, and so picking a place that would showcase how different it was very important. The committee that was making these decisions on where to drop the atomic bomb settled on two psychological objectives for the first atomic bombing in world history: to scare the Japanese into unconditional surrender, and to impress upon the world and the Soviet Union the power of the new weapon that was now in the possession of the United States. So, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, waited a few days, the Japanese didn't surrender, and then dropped another one on a different city, also full of civilians, called Nagasaki. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese military situation was hopeless. The US Navy controlled the waters around Japan and could bomb its cities with impunity, yet the Japanese still refused to surrender, hoping that by holding out, they could negotiate more favorable terms. By August, the Americans forced the situation with these two atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This map shows kind of the radius of the fallout, but it's also important to remember that atomic bombs aren't just destructive in terms of the city that they destroy. They leave radiation, which can cause cancer and all kinds of awfulness for survivors. Now, you could argue that the United States succeeded in both of these goals. They wanted Japan to surrender, and eventually Japan did. They wanted to show the world the destructive capacity of atomic weapons, and they certainly did that too. But the question remains, was it necessary? And was this a precedent that we should have set? For your notes, please include the following information. During World War II, scientists in the United States were busy working on a top-secret revolutionary new weapon, the atomic bomb. The US dropped two such bombs over two Japanese cities. These acts ended the war in the Pacific, but have remained intensely controversial due to the moral and ethical questions they raise. These questions involve the target, which involved civilians, their intent, which was to demonstrate the power of a weapon of mass destruction, and the effects of the weapon. They can literally end the world, and the radiation damage caused problems for generation upon generation after. This was the only time nuclear weapons have been used in warfare to date. Here's how it went. Fighting between the US and Japan continued after the war ended with Germany in 1945. The United States argued that dropping a bomb would end the war quickly with fewer casualties, fewer American casualties, than continuing the fighting. So, the US dropped the atomic bomb Little Boy on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Japan didn't surrender. So the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Then Japan surrendered by August 15th. This, I'll say it again, was a weapon of mass destruction used on intentionally civilian targets as part of a war strategy. Atomic bombs are very different from regular bombs. A conventional bomb targets a specific area and releases most of its energy in the form of a blast. Atomic bombs, on the other hand, release 50% energy as a blast, 35% is heat, and 15% is nuclear radiation. When a nuclear bomb explodes, most people within a radius of 3 to 30 miles would either get killed or seriously injured. The possible burnout in towns and cities could be as large as 100 square kilometers for 1 megaton explosion. In addition to the great heat and the blast, nuclear bombs also release radiation. First is an immediate radioactivity pulse, which can kill people on the spot if the dose is high enough. And the second form is persistent radioactivity, or one that continues to be present even after the blast. Leading into the next conflict we look at, the Cold War. The fact that this was a top secret project that the US didn't tell all of its allies about, especially not the Soviet Union, was a big source of mistrust and had long-term repercussions in terms of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. It would also set the tone for the Cold War, because it wouldn't be long until the Soviet Union got its hands on these weapons as well. And then what happens if you have two states that are in conflict with one another, that both possess weapons that, if used, could literally end life on this planet as we know it? So I'll leave you with a few big questions, and then you can pause the video and take notes. Was the use of nuclear weapons to end World War II justified? And if not, what specifically about the weapons or the way they were used do you think was wrong, and why? If yes, under what circumstances generally could such weapons be used in a justified way, and what are the risks associated with this precedent? In what way does using nuclear weapons and targeting civilians in other bombing raids compromise this narrative of World War II as a moral war? Are there some forms of mass state-sponsored violence that are worse than others? Are there good guys and bad guys in World War II? How can you tell, and what is your criteria? When an order is given that results in the deaths of massive numbers of civilians, who is ultimately responsible? And here think both about the Holocaust, but also about Hiroshima. Is it the person who had the idea? Is it the context that allowed the idea to seem reasonable to people? Is it the soldiers who do the violent part, or the citizens who don't speak out against it? And I'll ask the big question here again, to what extent are civilians responsible for the acts of the state? People often look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and defend the dropping of these bombs by saying, well, they bombed Pearl Harbor. And the fact of the matter is that while people in Japan with the power to make decisions about bombing places chose to bomb Pearl Harbor, the people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, kids, women, old ladies, they didn't do it. They might have been against it. We don't know. They might have been for it. We don't know. So, to what extent do we hold civilians accountable for the wartime decisions of their leadership? And how do we protect civilians from the casualties of war in this modern age of weapons that can be targeted basically anywhere, and in an age of warfare where resources and civilian support can make all the difference between winning and losing? So, if you figure out the answers to any of these questions, please let me know. So pause here, take notes, and we are done.